Hello everyone, my name is Smajo Beso. I work at Newcastle University as a researcher and teacher. I'm also the chair of the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust. I will be talking a bit about my experience of growing up in Bosnia during the war. I know a lot of you will have learned already about the Second World War and the Holocaust, but I'm guessing not many of you will know or will have heard about what happened in Bosnia just 25 years ago. So just for a bit of context, that's Bosnia there in red. I was born in a little town in southern Bosnia called Stolac, a beautiful part of Bosnia, with a lot of incredible architecture and natural landscapes. And Bosnia was very much a modern and normal European country. We had everything that we have here: cinema, theatre, museums. A year before I was born, Bosnia hosted the Winter Olympics in the capital, Sarajevo. And some of your teachers might remember Torval and Dean becoming the highest scoring figure skaters of all time. Childhood in Bosnia was just incredible. That's me with the blonde hair being held by one of my cousins. We had just moved into our new home that my parents had designed and built. We had just bought a little puppy. My parents were in their mid-30s, about my age now, and we weren't raised to differentiate between people's skin color or religious belief. In my family, we still have Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists. The only difference between us kids was which cartoon we liked, which books we liked to read, and always the big question, which football club we supported. I just knew at certain times of the year, we would visit our friends on Christmas, we would buy presents for each other, we would have a meal, and then they would do the same for us in Eid. But then there came a time when none of that mattered anymore, and Bosnia became the scene of the biggest atrocities on European soil just 50 years on from the Holocaust. More than 100,000 people were killed. More than 2 million people were expelled from their homes and became refugees. Between 20 and 80,000 young girls and women were raped. And Bosnia became the biggest network of concentration camps since the Holocaust. There are still more than 7,000 missing persons in Bosnia today. We are so used to seeing news reports, documents, statistics about war, about refugees, about migrants, but sometimes it's very easy to forget that behind every statistic, behind every number, there is a human being and a human experience. I would like to share with you a small part of my own personal experience. My family came to the UK in July 1994 as refugees, and we left everyone and everything behind because we had no other choice. It's easier to imagine murder and rape to be perpetrated by strangers, by monsters. You don't expect normal people to be able to do these things. You never think they can happen to you. You think that's something that happens somewhere else, to someone else, things that you see on TV, but they can't happen to you. You can imagine unknown soldiers coming into town, maybe even speaking a different language, wearing a uniform covered in unfamiliar symbols, or carrying a flag of a foreign country. It's easier to imagine that than to imagine your friend, your next door neighbor, your classmate, your teacher wanting to kill you just because of who you happen to be. But that is exactly what happened in Bosnia. And the majority of these perpetrators before the war were good, ordinary, normal people, but somehow they accepted an ideology and belief that a whole group of people didn't belong anymore, in the same way that many Germans were persuaded into thinking that all Jews didn't belong in Germany. In 1991, I was 6 years old, and this is roughly when the war started in Bosnia. So I was old enough to see things gradually changing around me, but I didn't fully understand what was happening. I was too young. I was too busy preoccupied with being a child. But I could pick up bits that my parents and the other adults were discussing around me. I knew something was happening. And that's me on the right there with my cousin in the middle and my brother far left. One day I remember running into the house and my mom was in front of the TV crying. She tried to hide her tears, but I could see she was upset. As a child, you sense the emotions on your parents' face. She hugged me and kissed me, just like she always did, and said, go outside and play and don't worry, everything's all right. Again, as a child, I just did what she asked. And it was only years later that I realized that my mom was actually watching TV of war spreading across the country. And she knew sooner or later it would come to us. And she was completely helpless. There was nothing she could do to help us. The first few months of war were probably the most difficult. We moved more than 14 times in the first 9 months alone. There was constant shooting, explosions, cries, and the shock of not having food and water, electricity, all the things that we take for granted now, they were all gone just overnight. Then things, just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, they started getting even worse. In the summer of 1993, Croatians this time started rounding up all Bosnian Muslim men, including my dad, my uncles, and all my male relatives. The oldest person arrested was 90 years old, and the youngest was just 13. Local shops, hospitals, factories were set up as places of torture and rape, and concentration camps were set up across the country. My dad was taken to a camp called Drete. He lost 26 kilograms, or about 4 stone, in the first few weeks. This is my dad. This is after he was released and after 6 months, I think, post-release, and you can still see in this image how skinny he was. And these black and white images, you'd be forgiven for thinking this was Europe, 1943, this was the Holocaust, but sadly this was modern day Europe just 25 years ago. The next day, a group of soldiers came to take my uncle. They were led by his daughter's boyfriend. I still remember my sister screaming, "You've taken my dad, please don't take my uncle. You've taken my dad, please don't take my uncle." And she just kept repeating this over and over again. They went through the most inhumane torture, beatings on a daily basis, but I won't go into that now. Eventually, it was our turn, and soldiers forced us from our house and forced us to march to our local factory, actually the factory where my dad had worked just a few months before. Some houses were already on fire, as were libraries and museums. We saw young girls and women being singled out. My mom was holding on to me so hard, I remember my hand actually hurting. Soldiers took us into our room, family at a time, and my mom was forced to sign this document to say she was giving everything up for safekeeping. Just a few months ago, or maybe a year or over a year ago now, while doing research at the university, I actually found that very document that my mom signed on the 4th of August, 1993, which said that my mom had handed over for safekeeping 2 pairs of earrings and her wedding ring. She is number 13 on the list, and that is her signature right there. When I showed this document to my mom, because documents like this are so incredibly important, my mom broke down in tears. It was finally a physical proof of that day, of that experience. But it's impossible for documents like this to convey the reality, the emotion, the experience of what happened that day. Because this document can never tell us really how we felt and what we experienced. It doesn't tell us that the earrings were taken from my little sister and they had been given to her by my granddad just before he passed away. It doesn't tell us how my sister cried and begged them not to take them off her. It doesn't tell us how I was bribed with chocolate. One of the soldiers kept saying to me, "If you tell me where your mom is hiding the money, I'll buy you a big chocolate bar." And I remember looking up and I could see myself crying in the reflection of his sunglasses. It doesn't tell us how my mom knew one of the soldiers and that he had a family of his own, and how my mom begged, but that didn't help us. It doesn't tell us anything about how the soldiers then started searching and grabbing my mum. It doesn't tell us how scared I was. It doesn't tell us how much we screamed and cried. These soldiers didn't see a friend anymore. They didn't see a mother with kids. They didn't see the humanity in us. We were reduced to a statistic, to a signature, to a piece of gold, to money. That is exactly what dehumanization leads to. We were then loaded onto trucks and driven towards Bosnian controlled territory and forced to march on foot for the rest of the way. There was belongings scattered across the road, elderly unable to walk from exhaustion, sitting and crying by the side of the road. At one point, I stepped over what I thought was a pile of clothes and a full mattress covering them. But as I stepped over it, the mattress slid off and I could feel something under my feet. And as the mattress slid off, I realized it was the body of an old man. After weeks of constantly moving and living in ruins just like this, we eventually settled in a town called Mostar. And that's the one with the bridge right at the start that I showed you. And we were lucky. We stayed with my mom's sister, my auntie Amina, and she had 2 kids, and my uncle was there as well. And my grandparents had been forced out of their home previously, and they were staying with her as well. And she was always my favorite auntie. She always had a smile on her face. She was always joking around. She had this beautiful, long, wavy hair, and she was 38, just a few years older than me now. Mostar was surrounded on one side by Croatians and on Serbs on the other side. And we were hungry. There wasn't a day that we didn't go to sleep hungry. But my mom and my auntie were so creative, and they always managed to put food on the table. They started using chicken feed to make bread. They started using grass to make pies. So we always had something to eat. We started night school, really, as an act of defiance. We're here trying to learn, and you're over there trying to kill us. My last night of school, I remember really well. It was on the 23rd of January, 1994. Shelling was more intense than usual, and my mom wasn't sure whether to let us go. But we were desperate to get out of the house because being at school, and we had missed so much school already, was a brief moment of normality. We went to school that night, and Croatians used a plane to drop bombs onto Mostar. Through my classroom window, I could see our whole street up in flames. There was so much panic, screaming and crying, but I just stood still. I don't remember screaming or crying or running because I just kept looking at our house. Back at the house, my auntie Amina was wounded. My grandparents and her 2 sons and my sister carried her out of the house on a blanket. They managed to get her into a car, but petrol was almost impossible to come by. They pushed. They managed to get her into another car. It had a bit of petrol. They drove. This is while being shot at and shelled. It's pitch black. That car ran out of petrol as well, and they pushed. They managed to get her to a hospital, but it really was a makeshift hospital without any medical equipment or medicine, but at least they had doctors. By this point, she had lost so much blood, and doctors fought very hard to try and save her life. And unfortunately, she passed away at 4 o'clock the next morning. The easiest thing for my mom, the most soothing thing to do in that moment, she's just lost her sister. Her kids are starving. She hasn't seen her husband for months or any of her male relatives. The easiest and the most soothing thing would have been to tell us to direct our anger at all Croatians, to tell us that they're all the same, that they're all responsible. But she realized what impact this could have on us. She sat us down on the very day that her sister was killed, and she did the most courageous thing. She carefully explained that we can't live our life in anger and hate. We can't generalize and think everyone is the same. And that the best way to resist those who were killing us was not to become hateful and angry like them. A few months later, the British Red Cross came, and we literally had a couple of hours to say goodbye to family and friends. We were reunited with my father in Newcastle after more than a year. So he was brought to the UK straight from a concentration camp. And again, he didn't really have much say in that matter. I was 9 years old at the time. I joined school in year 5. I loved my teacher. She was great. She was so friendly, but I couldn't understand a word she was saying. At the end of every day, she had this tradition where she'd play the guitar, or the kids would be singing around. And I figured out roughly what they were singing about, but again, I just couldn't understand it. And she would sing the first verse of the song, then she would say someone's name, they would become part of the song, and they would get to go home first. And they were all so happy, and they were all singing, and I hated this part of the day. And I remember one day we sat down again, and I was thinking, oh, not this again. She started playing the guitar, they all started singing, but this time they started singing the song in Bosnian. It was one of the most incredible things ever. This little act of kindness had such a massive impact on my life. It was the first day that I went home with a smile on my face. So while I was out learning English, I had separate lessons, she made this incredible effort to teach them this song in Bosnian. For my brother and sister, it was a lot harder. They were a lot older. My brother went to university, did biomedical science, got a first, he did really well, then studied medicine. Now he's a doctor here in Newcastle. My sister, she started working with refugees and vulnerable people, and she does this today as well. Newcastle has been our home, the Northeast, the UK. It's given us an opportunity to rebuild our lives. And we're also proud of being part of this region. And really, none of this would have been possible if we didn't have the help and support of the incredible teachers that were teaching us at the time. Because remember, our parents couldn't speak English, so they couldn't help us with personal statements, with career choices. So if it wasn't for those amazing teachers and the incredible people in the Northeast, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you for listening. That was fairly rushed, but if you have any questions, feel free to email me and I'll try and answer them as soon as I can. Thank you all for listening.